The Missouri 1998 cold case that shocked a community began on a spring morning when 12-year-old Megan Scherer kissed her mother goodbye in their white farmhouse near Portageville. By evening, both mother and daughter were dead shot at close range in their own home. Sherri Scherer, 38, had fought back against her attacker. Megan had likely surprised the intruder after returning from a friend's house. The new Madrid County community reeled in disbelief as investigators collected DNA evidence and promised swift justice. But weeks turned to months, then years. The case went cold. Detectives retired. Hope faded. Then, in 2007, advanced DNA testing finally identified the killer, Timothy Sear, a convicted serial murderer already serving life sentences for other brutal crimes across the Midwest. He had lived in the region during the 1990s. The DNA was undeniable. But would this small farming town ever see true justice for Sherri and Megan Scherer? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning of the 28th of March 1998 dawned clear and bright over the farmland surrounding Portageville, Missouri. Sunlight spilled golden across endless rows of newly planted corn, and the air carried the sweet scent of spring blossom. In the simple white house on County Road 283, 38-year-old Sherri Scherer moved quietly through her morning routine, careful not to wake her 12-year-old daughter Megan. Sherri stood at the kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the fields amber. She'd lived in this house for 8 years, raising Megan mostly alone after her divorce. The isolation sometimes weighed on her, but she found peace in the rhythm of rural life. The kettle whistled softly on the stove. She poured coffee into her favorite blue mug and savored the quiet moments before her daughter woke. Upstairs, Megan stirred beneath her floral comforter. Her room was a testament to a 12-year-old's dreams. Drawings she'd made taped to the walls, stuffed animals lined up on shelves, and a desk where she spent hours writing stories about far-off places. She bounced downstairs in her pajamas, dark hair tousled from sleep. "Morning, baby," Sherri said, wrapping her daughter in a warm hug. "Sleep good?" Megan rubbed her eyes. "Can I go to Jessica's house today? Her mom said we could work on our art project." Sherri smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind Megan's ear. "Of course. But breakfast first." They sat together at the small kitchen table, sharing scrambled eggs and toast while morning light streamed through checkered curtains. Megan chattered about school, her friends, and the teacher she hoped to become someday. Sherri listened, memorizing every word, every laugh. These quiet mornings together were her treasure. After breakfast, Megan ran upstairs to get dressed. She returned wearing jeans and her favorite purple sweater, backpack slung over her shoulder. "I'll be back before dinner," she promised, standing on tiptoes to kiss her mother's cheek. "Be careful," Sherri called as Megan headed for the door. "I love you." "Love you too, Mom." Megan waved from the doorway, her smile bright as the morning Sunday. Then she was gone, walking down the gravel drive toward Jessica's house 3 miles away. Sherri watched through the window until her daughter disappeared around the bend. The house felt suddenly empty without Megan's energy filling it. She finished her coffee and began tidying up, humming softly to herself. The afternoon stretched long and peaceful. Sherri worked in her small garden, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants she'd started from seed. The soil was rich and black beneath her fingernails, and she found comfort in the simple act of tending growing things. She'd planted this garden after the divorce, needing something that was entirely hers to nurture. Inside the house, she folded laundry and cleaned the bathroom, radio playing softly in the background. Country music drifted through the rooms, songs about heartbreak and small-town life that felt like her own story set to melody. She paused sometimes to look at framed photos on the mantel, Megan as a baby, family, Christmas mornings, her daughter's school pictures through the years. Around 2 o'clock, she made herself a sandwich and sat on the front porch to eat. The view from her porch stretched across fields to the horizon, broken only by the occasional farmhouse or grain silo. It was the kind of place where neighbors still waved when they drove past, where people knew each other's families going back generations. She didn't notice the figure watching from the tree line, didn't see the shadow moving closer to her house as she went back inside. The afternoon remained peaceful in her mind, just another quiet day in the country. At 4:30, she started preparing dinner. Megan would be home soon, full of stories about her day with Jessica. Sherri seasoned chicken breasts and put them in the oven, then began peeling potatoes for mashing. She worked with practiced efficiency, movements smooth from years of cooking for two. The house grew warmer as the oven heated. Late afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Sherri hummed while she worked, occasionally glancing at the clock. Megan was usually home by 5. She didn't hear the back door open, didn't sense the danger until footsteps sounded behind her in the kitchen. When she turned, a stranger stood there, a tall man with cold eyes and calloused hands. Her heart stopped. "What do you want?" she managed to whisper. He didn't answer with words. The attack came swift and brutal. Sherri fought back with everything she had, screaming for help that wouldn't come. She knocked over chairs, shattered dishes, left her fingernails embedded in his skin. But she was alone, miles from the nearest neighbor. Megan's laughter echoed across Jessica's backyard as the two girls worked on their art project beneath the shade of an old oak tree. They'd spent hours cutting pictures from magazines, arranging them into a collage about their dreams for the future. Megan's section showed teachers in classrooms, children reading books, and schools with bright, welcoming doorways. "I'm going to teach second grade," Megan declared, carefully gluing down a photo of smiling children. "Little kids are the best. They still believe everything is possible." Jessica nodded, focused on her own collage featuring horses and veterinary clinics. "My mom says you'd be a great teacher. You're always helping the younger kids at church." Megan blushed at the compliments. She did love working with the little ones during Sunday school, reading them stories and helping them with crafts. Something about their wide-eyed wonder made her feel useful, needed. As the afternoon wore on, the girls packed up their supplies and went inside for a snack. Jessica's mother, Linda, served them chocolate chip cookies and milk while they chatted about school and their plans for spring break. The kitchen felt warm and safe, filled with the comfortable sounds of family life. Around 5 o'clock, Megan glanced at the clock on the microwave. "I should head home. Mom's probably starting dinner." Linda offered to drive her, but Megan waved off the suggestion. "It's not far. I like walking." She hugged Jessica goodbye and thanked Linda for the cookies. "Tell your mother I said hello," Linda called as Megan headed down the front steps. The walk home took Megan through familiar countryside past the Hendersons' dairy farm, over the small creek that ran clear and cold even in summer, through the patch of woods where she sometimes found wildflowers for her mother. She walked slowly, enjoying the warm evening air and thinking about her art project. She was still smiling when she reached her own driveway. The house looked peaceful, in the golden evening light, smoke rising from the chimney. But something felt different. The front door stood slightly ajar, which was odd. Her mother always kept it closed to keep the bugs out. "Mom?" she called, pushing the door open. "I'm home." Silence greeted her. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty house, but something heavier, more troubling. Megan's stomach began to flutter with unease. "Mom?" she called again, louder this time. She found her mother in the kitchen. Sherri lay motionless on the linoleum floor, her body positioned in a way that made Megan's breath catch in her throat. The room showed signs of a struggle: overturned chairs, broken dishes, spatters of red on the white cabinets. Megan stood frozen in the doorway, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not to them. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned and saw him, the same man who had attacked her mother. His clothes were disheveled, his hands stained. He looked at Megan with eyes that held no mercy, no humanity. She never had a chance to scream. At 7:30 that evening, Madrid Scherer tried calling her daughter's house for the third time. The phone rang and rang, but no one answered. This wasn't like Sherri, who always picked up by the second ring. Marie felt a familiar knot of worry form in her stomach. "Still no answer?" asked her husband, Harold, looking up from his evening paper. "Number. And Sherri was expecting me to call about Sunday dinner." Marie hung up the phone and walked to the kitchen window. She could see the lights of Sherri's house in the distance, maybe 2 miles across the fields. "Something's not right." Harold set down his paper. After 40 years of marriage, he knew better than to dismiss his wife's instincts. "Want me to drive over there?" "We'll both go." They made the drive in worried silence, gravel crunching beneath the tires of Harold's pickup truck. The Scherer house came into view, looking normal from the outside. Lights glowed in the windows. Sherri's car sat in the driveway. But something indefinable felt wrong. Marie knocked on the front door while Harold waited by the truck. "Sherri? Megan?" She pressed her ear to the door. No sound from inside. She tried the handle and found it unlocked. The door swung open to reveal the living room, looking undisturbed. Family photos smiled from their frames. Megan's backpack sat on the couch where she dropped it. "Sherri?" Marie called into the house. Her voice echoed strangely in the silence. She walked toward the kitchen, Harold close behind her. The scene that greeted them there would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. Sherri lay sprawled on the floor, her clothing torn, blood pooling beneath her head. Evidence of sexual assault was unmistakable. "Oh God," Marie whispered, reaching for the wall to steady herself. Harold grabbed her arm, preventing her from moving closer to the body. "Don't touch anything," he said, his voice shaking. "Where's Megan?" They found the 12-year-old in the hallway leading to the stairs. She lay on her side, arms wrapped around her middle as if trying to protect herself even in death. She'd been shot once in the chest. Her purple sweater, so bright that morning, was now dark with blood. Marie collapsed to her knees, a sound escaping her throat that wasn't quite human. Harold fumbled for his cell phone with trembling fingers. 911, what's your emergency? This is Harold Scherer. We need police and an ambulance at 2847 County Road 283. My daughter-in-law and granddaughter. They're dead. Someone killed them. Within minutes, the quiet country evening erupted with sirens. Red and blue lights strobed across the fields as emergency vehicles raced down the gravel road. Deputies from the new Madrid County Sheriff's Office arrived first, followed by paramedics, then detectives from the Missouri State Highway Patrol. Detective Jeff McMullen took charge of the scene, his calm demeanor masking the rage building in his chest. 23 years in law enforcement hadn't prepared him for this. A mother and daughter, gunned down in their own home. The kind of violence that belonged in big cities, not in the farming communities of southeast Missouri. "Secure the perimeter," he told the arriving deputies. Nobody gets in or out without my say-so. By midnight, the Scherer house blazed with floodlights as crime scene technicians processed every inch of the property. Detective McMullen coordinated the investigation with methodical precision, his notebook filling with observations and questions that demanded answers. The killer had entered through the back door, probably while Sherri worked in the kitchen. Signs of sexual assault were evident, but the attack on Sherri had been interrupted. Megan's arrival home had surprised the perpetrator, leading to her murder as well. "We've got footprints by the back door," reported Officer Danny Walsh, the department's evidence specialist. "Size 11, boot, looks like work boots, and there's biological evidence on the victim." McMullen nodded grimly. In 1998, DNA testing was becoming more sophisticated, though it still took weeks to get results. Make sure everything gets to the state lab. Priority rush. Fingerprints were lifted from doorknobs, light switches, and surfaces throughout the house. Photographs documented every angle of the crime scene. The killer had been careful in some ways, no obvious trace evidence, no personal items left behind. But sexual assault cases often provided the biological evidence needed for identification. Outside, neighbors began gathering at the edge of the police perimeter. Word traveled fast in rural communities. The Hendersons from the dairy farm stood talking quietly with the Martins from down the road. Elderly Mrs. Patterson from the nearest house clutched her sweater tighter as she stared at the flashing lights. "Who would do such a thing?" she whispered to anyone who would listen. "Sherri was such a good girl. And that sweet little Megan." Marie Scherer sat in Harold's truck, wrapped in a blanket a paramedic had given her. She couldn't stop shaking. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her daughter's body on the kitchen floor. Her granddaughter in the hallway, still wearing the purple sweater Marie had given her for Christmas. Reverend Thomas from the Methodist Church arrived around 1 in the morning, word having reached him through the small-town network that carried both gossip and grief with equal speed. He climbed into the truck beside Marie and took her hand without speaking. Sometimes presence was more powerful than words. Detective McMullen approached the truck as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. His face looked haggard after hours of processing the worst crime scene of his career. "Mrs. Sherri, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions." Marie nodded, though her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Did Sherri have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt her?" "Number. Everyone loved Sherri. She helped at the church, volunteered at Megan's school. She'd give you the shirt off her back if you needed it." "What about ex-boyfriends? The girl's father?" "Sherri's ex-husband lives in California now. He sends child support but rarely visits." There wasn't anyone she was seeing romantically. She focused all her energy on raising Megan. McMullen made notes, though he suspected this was a stranger crime. The level of violence, the sexual assault, the apparent randomness of the victims, it pointed to a predator who had chosen the isolated house for its vulnerability. "We're going to catch whoever did this," he promised Marie. "I give you my word." As the sun rose over the Missouri farmland, casting long shadows across the crime scene, Detective McMullen had no way of knowing that his promise would take nearly a decade to fulfill. The funeral was held on a gray April morning at the First Methodist Church of Portageville. Every pew was packed, with mourners spilling out onto the front steps and gathering in the parking lot. The entire community came to say goodbye to Sherri and Megan Scherer, farmers still wearing their work clothes, teachers from the elementary school, children carrying hand-picked wildflowers. Reverend Thomas had struggled to find words adequate for such senseless loss. How do you explain why a loving mother and innocent child were taken so brutally? How do you comfort a community that suddenly felt unsafe in their own homes? Sherri lived her life in service to others, he said from the pulpit, his voice carrying across the hushed congregation. She taught Sunday school, organized food drives for struggling families, and raised a daughter who embodied kindness and hope. Megan dreamed of becoming a teacher because she wanted to help children learn and grow. Marie Scherer sat in the front pew, supported by Harold and her sister Ruth. She'd aged 10 years in the past week, her face drawn with grief that seemed bottomless. Behind her, Megan's classmates huddled together, some crying quietly, others staring at the two caskets with expressions too adult for their 12-year-old faces. Jessica, Megan's best friend, stood at the lectern during the service and read a poem she'd written. Megan loved to draw and write. Her smile made everything bright. She wanted to teach kids to read, to plant in little hearts the seed of dreams that reach up to the sky. We'll never understand why good people have to go away, but we'll remember her every day. There wasn't a dry eye in the church. Even the sheriff's deputies standing guard at the doors wiped tears from their faces. After the service, the funeral procession wound through the streets of Portageville, past the school where Megan should have graduated in 6 years, past the park where she'd played as a child, out to Sunset Memorial Cemetery, where 4 generations of Scherers lay buried. The entire town seemed to hold its breath as the caskets were lowered into the earth. Church bells tolled across the countryside as neighbors returned to their homes and locked their doors, many for the first time in their lives. The innocence of rural Missouri had been shattered along with the lives of Sherri and Megan Scherer. Detective McMullen attended the funeral, standing at the back of the church and watching the faces in the crowd. Sometimes killers attended their victims' services, drawn by a sick need to witness the pain they'd caused. He saw only genuine grief in every face, neighbors, friends, and family united in sorrow and bewilderment. After the burial, he drove back to the sheriff's office and opened the growing file on the Scherer case. DNA results wouldn't be available for several more weeks. Until then, he would follow every lead, interview every possible witness, and pray for the breakthrough that would bring justice for 2 innocent lives. Summer arrived hot and humid in New Madrid County, but it brought no relief from the shadow cast by the Scherer murders. Detective McMullen worked the case 16 hours a day, following up on tips called in by concerned citizens and running down leads that invariably led nowhere. The Missouri State Highway Patrol's Criminal Investigation Division had assigned 2 additional detectives to the case. They re-interviewed everyone who had known Sherri and Megan, looking for any detail that might provide a clue to the killer's identity. They canvassed every house within a 5-mile radius, searching for witnesses who might have seen a strange vehicle or unfamiliar person in the area. "We've got nothing," admitted Detective Sarah Williams during a case review meeting in July. "No witnesses, no suspicious vehicles reported, no clear motive. The only evidence is the biological material we're waiting on from the lab." McMullen studied the crime scene photos spread across the Graham conference table. Something nagged at him about the case, some detail that felt significant but remained just out of reach. What about registered sex offenders in the region? "We've interviewed everyone within a 100-mile radius. All have alibis for the 28th of March. The DNA results finally came back in August, inconclusive. The sample was too degraded for the testing technology available in 1998. McMullen felt like punching the wall when he got the call from the state lab. "What about retesting when the technology improves?" he asked the lab technician. "Maybe in a few years. DNA science is advancing fast, but for now we can't make a match with what we have." Meanwhile, life in Portageville slowly attempted to return to normal. Children went back to school in August, though parents drove them instead of letting them walk alone as they had for generations. Women installed new locks on their doors and jumped at every unexpected sound. The Scherer house stood empty, its windows growing dusty in the summer heat. Marie had asked the sheriff's department to keep it sealed as a crime scene, hoping evidence might still be discovered there. She couldn't bear the thought of anyone else living in the place where her daughter and granddaughter had died. Local teenagers began telling stories about the house being haunted, claiming they could see lights moving through the rooms at night. McMullen knew it was just grief and imagination combining in the way they always did after tragedy, but he made a point of driving by regularly to make sure no one was disturbing the scene. In September, as the first cool nights hinted at autumn's approach, McMullen was forced to admit the case was going cold. Active leads had been exhausted. The killer had vanished like morning mist, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. On the 6-month anniversary of the murders, he visited Marie Scherer at her home. She served him coffee in the same blue mug Sherri had used that last morning, though she didn't mention the connection. "Are you giving up?" she asked quietly. "No, ma'am. This case will never be closed until we get answers. But I have to be honest, we need new evidence or new technology to make progress." Marie nodded, stirring sugar into her coffee with shaking hands. "I dream about them every night. Sherri calls to me, but I can never reach her. Megan waves from far away, but she's always getting smaller, like she's disappearing." McMullen reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "We won't let them disappear, I promise you that." The first anniversary of the murders arrived with a late March snowfall, as if the earth itself was mourning. The candlelight vigil was held at the Methodist Church, the same sanctuary where Sherri and Megan's funeral had taken place a year earlier. Nearly 300 people attended, carrying candles that flickered like stars in the darkness. Marie Scherer spoke briefly, thanking the community for their continued support and asking everyone to keep praying for justice. Her voice broke when she tried to talk about her daughter and granddaughter. "They would want us to love each other," she finally managed to say, "to protect each other, to never give up hope." Detective McMullen stood at the back of the church, watching faces illuminated by candlelight. He'd spent the entire day going through the case file again, hoping fresh eyes might catch something he'd missed. But the evidence remained frustratingly thin. After the vigil, he drove out to the Scherer house. The building sat dark and empty, its windows boarded up now to keep out vandals and weather. Crime scene tape still fluttered from the front porch, though it was faded and torn after a year of Missouri weather. He sat in his patrol car for an hour, staring at the house and trying to imagine what had happened that day. The killer had approached from the back, probably across the fields where he could move unseen. He'd known the house, was isolated, known Sherri was likely alone during the day. Was it random? Had he simply been driving past and seen an opportunity? Or had he been watching, stalking, choosing his moment? McMullen had worked hundreds of cases during his career, but this one haunted him differently. Maybe it was the senseless brutality of killing a child. Maybe it was the way the community had been shaken to its core. Or maybe it was the promise he'd made to Marie Scherer, a promise he was beginning to fear he couldn't keep. Back at the sheriff's office, he found a new detective waiting for him. Tom Bradley had just transferred from the Kansas City Police Department, bringing big city experience to rural law enforcement. "I asked to be assigned to the Scherer case," Bradley said without preamble. "Read through all the files. Mind if I take a fresh look?" McMullen felt a mixture of relief and wounded pride. "Help yourself. Maybe you'll see something I missed." Bradley spent the next week immersing himself in every detail of the investigation. He re-interviewed witnesses, visited the crime scene, and studied forensic reports with the intensity of a scholar. But he reached the same conclusion as his predecessor. "We need that DNA evidence to be retested," he told McMullen. "Technology is improving fast. What couldn't be analyzed in '98 might be possible now." McMullen had been thinking the same thing. Budget's tight. The county commissioners don't want to spend money on cases that aren't going anywhere. Then we make them understand that this case isn't over. That evening, both detectives attended a county council meeting. McMullen spoke passionately about the need for new DNA testing, emphasizing the department's promise to the victim's family. "These weren't just statistics," he told the commissioners. "They were our neighbors." Sherri Scherer volunteered at the food bank. Her daughter tutored younger kids at church. "This community deserves justice." The commissioners agreed to authorize retesting, though they warned it could take months to get results. As winter melted into spring, McMullen and Bradley could only wait and hope that science would succeed where traditional detective work had failed. Detective Tom Bradley inherited a case that had already frustrated 2 generations of investigators. Fresh from the urban chaos of Kansas City, he brought new energy to the rural sheriff's office. But even his optimism was tested by the Scherer file. The DNA retesting he'd pushed for was approved, but bureaucracy moved slowly in the Missouri crime lab system. "Could be 6 months before we hear anything." The lab director told him over the phone. "Maybe longer. We're backed up with active cases." Bradley spent his waiting time reviewing every aspect of the investigation. He created timeline charts, mapping the victim's movements on the 28th of March, 1998. He studied aerial photographs of the property, looking for approach routes the killer might have used. He even drove to Illinois and Arkansas, following up on tips that had been deemed too distant to matter. Meanwhile, Detective McMullen was approaching retirement after 25 years in law enforcement. The Scherer case weighed on him like a stone, the one major investigation he'd been unable to solve. He'd made that promise to Marie Scherer, and promises to grieving mothers carried special weight in his moral universe. "You'll keep pushing when I'm gone?" he asked Bradley one evening as they worked late in the office. "Count on it. This case won't die with my watch." McMullen nodded, feeling some of the burden shift to younger shoulders. He'd taught Bradley everything he knew about the investigation, passed along every instinct and theory he'd developed. If anyone could crack the case, it would be Tom Bradley. The community had settled into a new normal by 2000. Children walked to school again, though parents remained more vigilant than before. Women still locked their finer doors. But the hypervigilance of the first year had faded into routine caution. Life moved forward because it had to. Marie Scherer aged visibly during those early years. The grief never left her face, etching deeper lines with each passing season. She kept Sherry's house exactly as it was, paying the utilities and maintenance costs even though she never set foot inside. It stood as an unofficial memorial, a reminder that justice remained undone. Every few months, she would call the sheriff's office to ask about progress. Bradley always took her calls personally, updating her on new developments even when there weren't any. "Mrs. Scherer, I want you to know we sent the DNA evidence for retesting. The technology is getting better every year. Do you really think it will help?" she would ask, hope and skepticism warring in her voice. "I have to believe it will. We're not giving up." In 2001, advances in DNA technology allowed for testing of smaller, more degraded samples. Bradley pushed the case back to the top of the lab's priority list, calling in favors and applying gentle pressure wherever possible. The biological evidence from the crime scene represented their best hope for identifying Sherri Scherer's killer. The waiting continued through 2002 and into 2003. Bradley worked other cases, domestic violence calls, cattle theft, the occasional drug bust, but part of his mind always remained focused on the unsolved murders. He kept photographs of Sherri and Megan on his desk, a daily reminder of the justice they deserve. DNA science continued evolving rapidly. What had been impossible in 1998 became routine by 2004. The combined DNA index system CODIS database was expanding, allowing investigators to compare unknown samples against profiles from convicted offenders across the country. Finally, in early 2005, the Missouri State Crime Lab called with news that made Bradley's heart race. "We got a hit," the technician said. "Your 1998 sample matches someone in the CODIS database." The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in January 2005. Detective Bradley was reviewing budget reports when the crime lab technician's voice cut through the routine of his day like a lightning bolt. "The biological evidence from your Scherer case, we got a match in CODIS." Bradley dropped his pen and reached for a notepad. After 7 years of waiting, he could hardly believe what he was hearing. "Tell me." "The DNA profile matches a convicted offender named Timothy Wayne Kratcher. Date of birth, the 23rd of April, 1944. He's currently serving multiple life sentences in Illinois for rape and murder charges." Bradley's hand was shaking as he wrote down the name, Timothy Kratcher. He'd never heard it before, but within hours he would know more about this man than he wanted to. The first call was to Detective McMullen, now 6 months into retirement but still haunted by the case he'd never solved. "Jeff, we got him. DNA match on the Scherer murders." There was silence on the line, then a sharp intake of breath. "Are you sure?" "Lab's positive. Guy named Timothy Kratcher. Ever heard of him?" No, but I'm about to learn everything there is to know. Within hours, both detectives were deep in research mode. What they discovered about Timothy Scherer chilled them to the bone. Born in 1944, he had compiled a horrific record of sexual violence across multiple states. His crimes spanned the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, targeting women who lived alone in vulnerable locations. In 1982, Scherer had murdered Brenda Parsh, a 23-year-old student at Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau. He'd killed Sheila Cole, a pregnant woman in Cape Girardeau that same year. In 1977, he'd murdered Mildred Wallace, also in Cape Girardeau. All of his victims were women. All had been sexually assaulted before being killed. He lived in the region, Bradley told McMullen over the phone. Cape Girardeau is less than 50 miles from Portageville. He knew the area. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Scherer was a serial killer who had operated throughout the Midwest for over a decade, targeting vulnerable women and leaving death in his wake. The Scherer murders fit his profile perfectly: an isolated house, a woman alone, the brutality of the attack. Most shocking of all, Scherer had been convicted and sentenced to multiple life terms in 1983. He'd been in prison for 15 years when Sherri and Megan were killed. How was that possible? Further investigation revealed the answer. In 1998, Scherer had been serving time at Western Illinois Correctional Center, but the prison system had a work-release program that allowed certain inmates to leave the facility during the day for employment. Records showed Scherer had been assigned to work detail that took him outside the prison walls. He had access, Bradley realized. Opportunity to travel, to hunt for victims. The investigators requested Scherer's complete prison records, mapping his movements and work assignments during the spring of 1998. What they found supported their growing certainty that he was responsible for the Scherer murders. On the 27th of March, 1998, the day before the murders, Scherer had been assigned to a work detail that took him within 20 miles of Portageville. He'd returned to prison late that evening, but there was a several-hour window during which his whereabouts were unaccounted for. Detective Bradley felt a familiar surge of adrenaline that came with breaking a major case. After 7 years of dead ends and frustration, they finally had their killer. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. The timing and opportunity aligned perfectly. Now came the hardest part: getting justice for Sherri and Megan Scherer. Detective Bradley's next call was to Marie Scherer. He'd rehearsed the conversation in his mind, knowing the news would be both a relief and a reopening of old wounds. "Mrs. Scherer, this is Detective Bradley. I have important news about your daughter and granddaughter's case." There was silence on the line, then a sharp intake of breath. "You found him?" "Yes, ma'am. We have a DNA match. The killer is a man named Timothy Scherer. He's already in prison for other murders." Marie began to cry, not the sharp tears of fresh grief, but the deep, shuddering sobs of someone who had carried an unbearable weight for 7 years and could finally set it down. "Are you going to arrest him? Will there be a trial?" That was the question Bradley had been dreading. "We're working with prosecutors now to determine the best course of action. This is complex because he's already serving multiple life sentences." The complexity went far beyond Scherer's existing convictions. By 2005, he was 61 years old and had been incarcerated for over 20 years. He'd never admitted guilt for any of his crimes and maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Scott County prosecutor Paul Boyd reviewed the case with the methodical care that had made him one of Missouri's most respected legal minds. Boyd understood the emotional stakes: a grieving family desperate for closure, a community that had waited 7 years for answers. But he also understood the practical limitations of the criminal justice system. "The DNA evidence is solid," Boyd told Bradley during a meeting in his cramped office. "But Scherer's already serving multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. He'll die in prison regardless of what we do." "What about justice for the Scherers? Don't they deserve their day in court?" Boyd had prosecuted hundreds of cases during his career, and he'd learned to balance justice against reality. A trial would cost the county hundreds of thousands of dollars. Scherer will fight the charges, demand a public defender, drag this out for years. And even if we convict him, it doesn't change his sentence or his fate. Bradley felt frustration building in his chest. "So we just let him get away with it?" "He's not getting away with anything. He's spending the rest of his life in a concrete cell. The question is whether putting the Scherer family through a lengthy trial serves any real purpose." The detective understood Boyd's logic, but it felt like betrayal. He'd promised Marie Scherer that they would find her daughter's killer. He'd never promised they would prosecute him. Meanwhile, word of the DNA match began to leak through law enforcement circles. Scherer had been connected to other unsolved cases across the Midwest, and detectives from multiple jurisdictions wanted to interview him. But the man who had terrorized women for decades refused to cooperate. At Western Illinois Correctional Center, Scherer received visitors in a sterile conference room, shackled to a metal chair. He was older now, grayer, but his eyes still held the cold calculation that had made him such an effective predator. "I have nothing to say about Missouri," he told Detective Bradley during their first interview. "You can't prove anything. We have your DNA from the crime scene, your biological evidence on Sherri Scherer's body." Scherer smiled, a chilling expression that never reached his eyes. "DNA can be contaminated. Evidence can be planted. I was in prison in 1998. You were on work release. You had opportunity. Prove it. The interview lasted 2 hours and yielded nothing. Pratcher answered every question with variations of "I don't remember" or "I have no comment." He seemed to enjoy the cat and mouse game, the power he still held over his victims' families even from behind bars. Bradley left the prison feeling defeated. Without a confession, the case remained circumstantial despite the DNA evidence. And Boyd was right, even a successful prosecution wouldn't change Scherer's fate. The decision was made to not file charges, though the case remained technically open. For the Scherer family, it was a hollow victory. They had their answer, but not their justice. The news broke in local media during the summer of 2007. DNA links convicted killer to 1998 Scherer murders read the headline in the Southeast Missourian. Within hours, the story spread through New Madrid County like wildfire. At the Coffee Cup Cafe in Portageville, farmers and retirees gathered around worn Formica tables, discussing the revelation that had finally named Sherri and Megan's killer. The conversations were a mixture of relief and frustration. "Always wondered if we'd ever know who did it," said Bill Henderson, whose dairy farm bordered the old Scherer property. "Least now we got answers." "But no trial," added Martha Collins, who had taught Megan in 5th grade. "Seems like he's getting away with it, even locked up." Similar discussions played out in every gathering place across the community. The DNA evidence was irrefutable, but the lack of prosecution felt like incomplete justice. People understood the practical reasons Scherer's existing life sentences, the cost of a trial that would change nothing, but understanding didn't ease the frustration. Marie Scherer found herself at the center of media attention she'd never wanted. Reporters called her house at all hours, requesting interviews about how it felt to finally know her daughter's killer. She declined most requests, but agreed to speak with the local newspaper. "It's a relief to have answers," she told the reporter, sitting in her living room beneath photographs of Sherri and Megan. "For 9 years, we wondered who could do such a terrible thing. Now we know, but it doesn't bring them back." The reporter asked if she was satisfied with the decision not to prosecute Scherrer. Marie was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "I would have liked to see him face a jury, to hear them say he was guilty. But he's already in prison for life. Maybe that's justice enough." Detective Bradley wasn't convinced. He'd spent years building this case, following every lead, pushing for DNA testing when the technology became available. To have it end not with handcuffs and a trial, but with a prosecutorial decision based on cost-benefit analysis, felt wrong. He made one final trip to interview Scherer, hoping the media attention might have changed the killer's attitude. It hadn't. If anything, Scherer seemed more smug, more pleased with himself. "Saw my name in the papers," he said with that same chilling smile. "Quite a stir I've caused. Why won't you just admit what you did? Give the families some peace?" Scherer shrugged. "What families? I don't know what you're talking about." The interview lasted 15 minutes before Bradley walked out in disgust. Some people, he realized, were beyond redemption. Some evil was so complete that it couldn't be reasoned with or appealed to. Back in Portageville, life continued its steady rhythm. The revelation about Scherer had answered the community's longest-standing question, but it hadn't healed all the wounds. Parents still watched their children more carefully. Women still locked their doors at night. The innocence lost in 1998 couldn't be recovered by identifying the man who had stolen it. The Scherer house remained empty, its windows still boarded, weeds growing tall around the foundation. Marie paid to have the grass cut twice a year, but otherwise left the property untouched. It stood as an informal monument to violence and loss, a reminder that evil could reach even the most peaceful places. In the years following the DNA revelation, the Scherer case took on a different significance in New Madrid County. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder of vulnerability, but also a testament to the power of persistence and advancing science. Detective Bradley, now a sergeant, used the case in training seminars for younger officers. "Never give up on DNA evidence," he would tell them. "What we can't analyze today might be possible tomorrow. Technology is our greatest ally in cold cases." The case also sparked changes in how Missouri handled work release programs for violent offenders. Scherer's ability to leave prison during the day while serving time for rape and murder seemed incomprehensible in hindsight. New restrictions were put in place, requiring GPS monitoring and more stringent supervision. Marie Scherer found unexpected comfort in corresponding with other families whose loved ones had been killed by Scherer. Through victim advocacy groups, she connected with relatives of his confirmed victims in Illinois and other states. Their shared experience of loss and frustration created bonds that helped ease the isolation of grief. "It helps to know I'm not alone," she wrote in a letter to Brenda Parsh's mother. "Our daughters deserve justice, even if the system couldn't give it to them." The annual candlelight vigil continued, though its character evolved over time. What had begun as a desperate plea for answers became a celebration of memory and community resilience. Megan's former classmates, now in their 20s, still attended when they were in town. Teachers who had worked with both victims shared stories of their kindness and potential. Reverend Thomas, now in his 70s, still led the service each March. "We gather, not in anger, but in love," he would say from the church steps as candles flickered in the darkness. Sherri and Megan taught us that even in the face of evil, goodness endures. The old Sherri house finally came down in 2010. Marie made the decision after years of maintaining the empty building. "It's time," she told Harold one morning over coffee. "Keeping it standing isn't bringing them back." The demolition drew a small crowd of neighbors and curiosity seekers. As the first walls fell and the foundation was filled in, there was a sense of a chapter finally closing. The violence that had occurred there would be remembered, but the physical reminder could be laid to rest. In its place, Marie planted a small garden roses for Sherri, who had loved tending flowers, and sunflowers for Megan, who had always turned her face toward the light. A simple granite marker bore their names and the dates of their 2 short lives. Detective McMullen, enjoying his retirement but still haunted by the case that had defined his later career, visited the memorial on quiet afternoon. He would stand among the flowers, remembering his promise to a grieving mother and the partial fulfillment that DNA science had finally provided. "We got him," he would whisper to the marker. "It took too long, and it wasn't perfect, but we got him." Timothy Krejcer remained in prison, serving his multiple life sentences in anonymity. He'd achieved the notoriety he seemed to crave, but it brought him no pleasure as his health declined with age. The man who had terrorized women across the Midwest faded into obscurity, forgotten by all except those whose lives he had shattered. Justice, the community learned, didn't always arrive with gavels and verdicts. Sometimes it came quietly, in the form of answers long sought and names finally spoken. Sometimes it was enough to know the truth, even when the law couldn't fully address it. By 2015, a new generation was taking over law enforcement in New Madrid County. Young deputies who had been children when Sherri and Megan were killed now patrolled the same roads, protected the same communities. They knew the Scherer case from academy training and departmental lore, but for them it was history rather than lived experience. Sergeant Bradley, now nearing his own retirement, made sure the case file remained accessible and complete. "Someone might need this someday," he told the incoming sheriff. "There could be other victims we don't know about." Indeed, Scheer's DNA continued to be linked to unsolved cases across the Midwest. Cold case units in multiple states found matches to rapes and murders dating back to the 1970 seconds. Each connection added another chapter to his catalog of violence, another family that finally received answers decades after their loss. The Scherer case had become a model for how DNA evidence could solve the seemingly impossible. At conferences and training seminars, Missouri investigators shared their experience with colleagues from other jurisdictions facing similar challenges. "Preserve everything," Bradley would tell audiences of detectives and crime scene technicians. "What seems hopeless today might be solvable tomorrow." Marie Scherer, now in her 80s, had settled into a different relationship with her grief. The sharp edge of loss had worn smooth over the years, replaced by something more manageable, a deep sadness that no longer consumed her days but would never fully disappear. She still lived in the same house where she'd received that devastating phone call in 1998. The rooms were filled with photographs of Sherri and Megan, along with pictures of grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had never met their lost relatives but knew their stories by heart. "Tell me about Aunt Sherri," 5-year-old Emma would ask, curling up beside Marie on the couch. She was kind. Marie would begin the same way she always did. "She helped people who were sad or lonely, and your cousin Megan was going to be a teacher. She loved children, just like you." These storytelling sessions had become sacred rituals, ways of keeping memory alive across generations. The children absorbed the stories without fully understanding the tragedy behind them, but they learned that Sherri and Megan had been important, had been loved, and were still remembered. The community had healed in the way small towns do, slowly, imperfectly, but with genuine care for one another. People still locked their doors at night, but the hypervigilance of the early years had faded. Children walked to school again, played in their yards until dark, experienced the kind of rural childhood that had been interrupted but not destroyed by violence. At the Methodist Church, a stained glass window installed in 2012 honored Sherri and Megan's memory. Sunlight streaming through colored glass cast rainbow patterns across the sanctuary where they had worshipped, where their funeral had been held, where the community had gathered in grief and slowly learned to hope again. The window depicted a teacher reading to children, with angels watching from above. Megan's dream of teaching lived on in that image, her aspirations immortalized in glass and light. Detective McMullen, now in his 70s, still drove past the site where the Scherer house had stood. The small memorial garden Marie had planted there flourished under her care, a spot of cultivated beauty in the midst of farmland that stretched to the horizon. Sometimes he would park his truck and walk among the flowers, remembering that March evening in 1998 when everything changed. He thought about the promise he'd made to Marie, the years of frustration and dead ends, the moment when science finally provided the answers he'd sought. It hadn't been perfect, justice, no handcuffs, no trial, no sentence pronounced in open court, but it had been truth, and truth had its own power to heal. The 20th anniversary of the murders arrived in March 2018 with an unseasonable warmth that reminded everyone of that terrible spring day 2 decades earlier. The community gathered as they had every year, but this milestone felt different, more reflective, more focused on memory than on the search for answers that had finally ended. Megan's former classmates, now in their 30s, came from across the country to attend the vigil. They brought their own children, continuing the cycle of remembrance that had sustained the community through its darkest years. Some had become teachers themselves, inspired by their lost friend's dream. She would have been 32. Jessica whispered to her husband as they stood outside the Methodist church, candles flickering in the warm evening air. She would have had children of her own by now. The vigil had evolved into something more than a memorial service. It had become an affirmation of community values, a yearly reminder to protect the vulnerable and never take safety for granted. Local law enforcement used the occasion to discuss home security, personal safety, and the importance of trusting instincts when something felt wrong. Sherri Scherer, now 85 and using a walker, still attended every year. Her voice was frailer than it had been in 1998, but her determination to keep her daughter's and granddaughters' memories alive remained fierce. 20 years, she said to the gathered crowd from the church steps. 20 years since we lost them, but they're not really gone as long as we remember them. As long as we tell their stories to our children and grandchildren. Behind her words lay the unspoken truth that the community had learned to live with Timothy Kreitzer was still alive in his prison cell, while his victims remained forever young in photographs and memory. The asymmetry of it seemed cosmically unfair, but dwelling on such things led only to bitterness. Instead, the community chose to focus on what could be controlled, loving each other, staying vigilant, and ensuring that no family would ever again wait 2 decades for answers to the most important questions of their lives. Detective Bradley, now retired but still living in the county, attended the vigil with his wife and adult children. He'd worked dozens of cases during his career, but none had affected him quite like the Scherer murders. Perhaps it was because he'd inherited the investigation from McMullen and felt the weight of a promise made by another man. Perhaps it was the senseless brutality of a child's death. Or perhaps it was the way the community had rallied around the victim's family, refusing to let them grieve alone. After the formal service, people lingered in small groups, sharing memories and catching up on family news. The gathering had the feel of a reunion, binding together people whose lives had been forever changed by tragedy, but who had chosen to build something meaningful from their shared loss. Young parents introduced their children to Marie, teaching them to be gentle with the elderly woman who carried such important memories. Teenagers who had grown up hearing the story of Sherri and Megan listened respectfully as older residents recounted details from that terrible time. As the evening wound down and people began to head home, Marie stood in the church parking lot surrounded by friends and family members. She looked out across the familiar landscape, fields where corn would soon be planted, farmhouses with porch lights glowing warmly, the peaceful countryside that had been her home for 8 decades. They would want us to be happy, she said to no one in particular. They would want us to live full lives and love each other well. It was a simple philosophy, born from unspeakable loss but tempered by time and faith. In a world where evil sometimes triumphed and justice sometimes came too late, it was enough to love well and remember truly. As Sherri Scherer approached her 90th birthday in 2023, she began making arrangements for the continuation of the annual vigils after her death. The tradition had become too important to the community to end with her passing, and she wanted to ensure that Sherri and Megan's memory would be preserved for future generations. She worked with the Methodist Church Board to establish a small endowment that would fund the yearly gathering indefinitely. Local high schools agreed to incorporate the Scherer case into their safety education curricula, using it as a teaching tool about personal security and community responsibility. I won't be here forever, Marie told her nephew during one of their regular visits. But their story needs to continue being told. The nephew, now in his 60s himself, had been one of the family members who discovered the bodies 25 years earlier. The trauma of that night had shaped his entire adult life, making him overprotective of his own children and grandchildren. But he understood the importance of preserving family history, even the painful parts. We'll make sure people remember, he promised his aunt. Timothy Kreitzer died in prison in early 2024. Succumbing to complications from diabetes at the age of 79. The news made a small mention in local newspapers, a brief paragraph noting the death of a man who had terrorized multiple communities across the Midwest. Detective McMullen, now retired for nearly 2 decades, felt a complicated mixture of relief and disappointment when he heard the news. Relief that a dangerous predator was finally gone from the world. Disappointment that Kreitzer had died without ever acknowledging his crimes or expressing remorse for the lives he destroyed. At least the families don't have to worry about him getting paroled, McMullen told his wife over their morning coffee. Though with all those life sentences, that was never really a possibility anyway. The death brought a strange sense of closure to those who had been touched by Kreitzer's crimes. He could never hurt anyone else. He could never taunt investigators with his silence or smile, that chilling smile during prison interviews. The chapter was finally, definitively closed. Marie received the news while sitting in her garden, the same garden where she planted flowers to honor her daughter and granddaughter. Spring was arriving early that year, and the first daffodils were pushing through the soil, their green shoots reaching toward the warming Sunday. She felt neither joy nor sadness at Kryger's death, only a quiet sense that justice had taken its own form. Not the courtroom justice she had once hoped for, but the final justice that comes to all living things. He was gone, and Sherri and Megan lived on in memory and love. The community prepared for the 26th annual vigil with the understanding that it might be one of Marie's last. Her health was declining, though her mind remained sharp and her commitment to keeping her family's memory alive never wavered. As the 28th of March, 2024 approached, people made special efforts to attend the vigil. Former residents drove in from distant cities. Retired law enforcement officers who had worked the case made plans to be there. Teachers who had known Megan brought their current students, continuing the educational tradition that had grown up around the tragedy. The gathering that year was the largest in over a decade, with nearly 400 people crowded into and around the Methodist church. Marie, now using a wheelchair, spoke from the front steps with the help of a microphone, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. 26 years ago, our community learned that evil can reach anywhere, she said, her words clear despite her age. But we also learned that love is stronger than evil, that memory is more powerful than death, and that communities that care for each other can survive anything. Present day. The morning sun cast long shadows across Sunset Memorial Cemetery as Marie Scherer's great-niece Emma knelt beside two weathered headstones, arranging fresh sunflowers she picked from the garden behind the old Methodist church. At 26, Emma had never known her lost relatives, but their story had shaped her understanding of family, community, and the fragility of safety that so many people took for granted. I brought you flowers, Aunt Sherri, she said quietly, her voice carrying across the still morning air. And I have news to share. Emma had recently accepted a teaching position at the elementary school in Portageville, fulfilling Megan's childhood dream in her own way. She would be teaching second grade, the same age group Megan had talked about wanting to help so many years ago. Great-Grandma Marie would have loved knowing that someone in the family became a teacher, she continued, settling onto the grass between the two graves. She always said you would have been proud. Marie had passed away peacefully the previous autumn, just a few months after Kryger's death in prison. Her funeral had drawn nearly 1,000 people, testament to the way she had touched lives through both her personal grace and her unwavering dedication to keeping her daughter's and granddaughter's memory alive. The annual vigil continued without her, organized now by a committee of longtime residents who had been moved by Marie's example. Emma served as the family representative, carrying forward the tradition of speaking about love, triumphing over loss, about community healing through shared remembrance. Detective McMullen, now 82 and moving slowly but still sharp, visited the cemetery that same morning. He'd made it a practice to stop by the graves every few months, a ritual that helped him process the case that had defined the final years of his career. "Morning, girls," he said, settling onto a bench nearby. "Emma, I saw the flowers. Marie would be pleased." Emma smiled at the old detective, grateful for his continued presence in her family's story. "She always said you kept your promise to her." McMullen nodded slowly. "Took longer than I hoped, but we got there eventually. Science caught up with justice, in its own way." They sat together in comfortable silence. Two generations united by tragedy but shaped by the healing that follows when communities refuse to let victims be forgotten. Around them, the cemetery stretched across gentle hills, white headstones marking lives that had ended but memory that endured. "Do you think they know?" Emma asked eventually. "That we caught him? That we never gave up?" McMullen considered the question seriously. "I think they know we love them enough to keep trying. That's what matters." In the distance, children's laughter carried on the morning breeze from the elementary school playground. A new generation was growing up in Portageville, most of them unaware of the tragedy that had once shaken their community to its core. They played freely, supervised by teachers who knew the story and parents who had learned to balance vigilance with trust. "I want to tell their story to my students," Emma said. "Not the scary parts, but the important parts. About how communities take care of each other. About how love doesn't end when someone dies." McMullen smiled. "That sounds just right. Marie would be proud." As the morning progressed, other visitors began arriving at the cemetery. Former classmates of Megan's, now adults, with children of their own. Retired law enforcement officers who had worked the case. Neighbors who had known Sherri as a kind woman who always had time to help others. They came not out of morbid curiosity, but out of genuine affection for two lives that had touched their community in meaningful ways. They brought flowers, they told stories, they shared memories that kept Sherri and Megan present in the world of the living. "We know who did it," Emma said softly, echoing words her great-grandmother had spoken countless times over the years. "We know the truth, and we remember them with love." The sun climbed higher, warming the earth and encouraging new growth in the garden Marie had planted so many years before. Spring had returned to southeast Missouri, as it always did, bringing with it the promise of renewal and the quiet persistence of hope. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest justice of all, not the punishment of evil, but the triumph of love over hate, memory over forgetting, community over isolation. Sherri and Megan Scherer lived on in the hearts of those who had known them and in the stories passed down to those who would never forget them. Their names were spoken with tenderness. Their dreams were honored through the actions of others. And in a small town in Missouri, justice was measured not only in courtrooms and convictions, but in the enduring power of a community's love.